You feel like you're ready? I am. Okay, you guys all ready? All right, here we go. And you got the camera rolling?
Is it rolling, Bob?
I'm Al Filreis, and this is PoemTalk at the Writer's House, where I have the pleasure of convening three friends in the world of poetry to collaborate on a close but not too close reading of a poem. We'll talk, maybe even disagree a bit, although looking at my friends here, maybe we won't disagree too much. And perhaps we'll open up the verse to a few new possibilities, and we hope gain for some poetry, in particular Tyrone Williams' poetry that deeply interests us, and we hope to gain for that poetry some new readers and listeners. And I say listeners because PoemTalk poems are available in recordings made by the poets themselves as part of our PennSound archive, writing.upenn.edu/PennSound. Today, I'm here at the Kelly Writer's House in our Arts Café, not in our studio, in our Arts Café. And I'm joined by some dear friends here on the PoemTalk panel, but also some PoemTalk listeners who have come to join us in person, a wonderful bunch of people who need to be heard. These people need to be heard. So I ask them now to put their hands together to welcome each other. Come on. That's not bad. Ooh, and there's some whistling. To welcome each other and us to this conversation. And they're going to want to praisefully applaud some more as I introduce our three poem talkers, who are Aldon Nielsen, poet, critic, editor, literary... Yeah, you could applaud Aldon. Literary historian, whose books include What I Say, Innovative Poetry by Black Writers in America, Trey, the book Trey, A Brand New Beggar, Poems of and About Blues Travelers. You didn't hear this from me, C.L.R. James, A Critical Introduction, Black Chant, Languages of African American Postmodernism, who has co-edited with Laura Vrana the collected poems of Lorenzo Thomas, a favorite volume of mine that I consult a lot, and that was published by Wesleyan in October 2019, what a bad time to be,
We had one.
A few months later, we were shut down, whose Back Pages selected poems came out in 2021, and whose Memoirs, written with Ethelbert Miller, was published by BlazeVox in 2022, and whose very first book of criticism, I found this out on Facebook, I think, the other day, Reading Race, White American Poets and the Racial Discourse of the 20th Century, is still in print. All right, so anybody listening to this, a few months from the time we're recording it, if it's still in print, go get a copy. I'm sure it's very inexpensive.
Well, considering what university press books cost these days, it is very inexpensive.
Okay, good. Buy that book. And buy Simone White, whose books include, Simone. Oh, I like this praiseful applause thing I've got going here. Whose books include Or on Being the Other Woman, 2022, Dear Angel of Death, 2018, among others. Whose honors include a 2021 Creative Capital Award, a 2017 Whiting Award in Poetry, and who will soon have a new book coming out from Duke University Press. Simone, the final title is Warring. Yes? Warring. And who I'm so happy to say is my colleague here at the Writer's House, where she is the Associate Faculty Director and has been co-leading and leading annual Kelly Writer's House Fellows Seminar and Program, and by Erica Hunt, who a few years back, well, you can snap, the mic will pick it up. A few years back was herself a totally fabulous Writer's House Fellow, whose recent book, a stunning achievement, is Jump the Clock, New and Selected Poems, published by Nightboat Books, and which includes poems from local history all the way through Veronica, A Suite, and X Parts. Wow, that's a great book. Who was, and now here's the quiz part for Aldon and Simone, who was born in... No idea. Come on. This is the great Erica Hunt. You should know.
Well, she was in California.
Want to take a guess? Anybody?
Brooklyn.
Manhattan.
Manhattan.
Yes. Whose BA, whose bachelor's degree is from...
I do not know that.
Didn't ask anybody who.
Well,
my
think
degree
about it. I mean,
was
think
from.
about Erica's early connections to the San Francisco-based language
San
people.
Francisco State.
SF State,
is.
San
How did I
Francisco
miss
State
that?
University, where she studied with. This can't be a quiz, but they're two.
It's too.
No, but I
That's
think
a
they're
little
really
obscure. You'd have
important.
to reach
They're not
through the-
obscure. These are major
the
people.
mists of time.
I mean, I see the influence.
Reaching
bio?
through.
I see the early influence of the early poems influenced by Kathleen Fraser. I
Oh
do.
yes.
Yeah.
Oh yes.
Kathleen Fraser
Love her.
and Michael Palmer,
Yeah.
and whose much read and much appreciated early essay notes on an oppositional poetics. And people in the audience, if you haven't read that, you need to. It's available online on the
Yes,
web.
it is.
I think I may have
In
PDF'd it and
multiple
put it
languages.
online. Was published in the influential 1990 collection, The Politics of Poetic Form. Erica Hunt, thank you. Welcome back to the Writer's House. It's so good to
Thank
see
you.
you.
Thank you.
Really glad to have you. Aldon, we're going to explain the tradition here of which this is a part in a second. And Simone, my friend, how are you?
I'm fine. Thank
It's
you.
good to see you.
Nice to
so
see
good
you.
to see you always.
Finally, a question we can answer.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, really.
Aldon and I are now just going to say something about this event, which is sort of in a lineage of events. Do you want to start and I'll finish?
Well, sure. Actually, the first time I was ever here was in the course of a John Edgar Wideman conference. The first time I was part of a PoemTalk, not till I'd moved to
John
Pennsylvania.
was a Writers House fellow in the first year of fellows, 2000.
Yeah. And
Creeley, Weidman, and Grace Paley.
this was shortly after that. And then Al kindly invited me to be a part of a poem talk on Rachel Lindsay upstairs. But then this tradition got started where Tyrone Williams and William J. Harris and myself would be invited to come and join in with whoever the poet happened to be. One of the most fun times was when the poet happened to be Tyrone Williams himself. But we also did the last one we did was with the wonderful Evie Shockley, and that was the last time either Evie or I, it was the last time we were on a program together. Tyrone and I went directly, we had just been at a reading in Brooklyn a few days before, and we both went directly from here to Niagara Falls to speak at a conference there, and that was the last time I saw Tyrone Williams.
Yes. So and a year ago we were together doing just this, a triple header, right? A poem talk, featuring Evie, followed by a studio discussion, and then an evening program. And we have decided that although this has been an annual thing, although went on hiatus during the pandemic, but it's been, I don't know, 6 or 7 of these, and we've decided that this will be the last because we just can't do it without, not the last program at the Writers House or the last Poem Talk, but this series. So we can't do it without Tyrone, and we're sad that Billy Joe Harris is unable to join us today. I know he's going to listen and watch.
And criticize.
Yes, and I guess we should just probably tonight we'll be reminiscing about Tyrone a little bit at our program, 6 o'clock. Please come. But I'll just say that Tyrone's baritone, recalcitrant, ignore Al's question mode was just so delightful. I was never annoyed by it. Always, Tyrone always said what he had to say. Well, the 4 of us today have gathered here to talk about a poem by the late, indeed, and much missed, indeed, Tyrone Williams. The poem is Charon on the Potomac, and it was well chosen here after the recent national election. It appears in the book as is, I-Z, and is a pun on Islam and some other things. Published by Omnidon in 2018. Tyrone's extensive PennSound page includes a February 7th, 2017 reading that he gave here at the Writers House, and you were sitting there, I believe, filling in gaps in his memory or something like that. And it was a memorable session introduced by, I believe, me and Charles Bernstein. Tyrone that night read a number of poems from the still not yet published as is, including our poem, the one we're about to talk about. As always here at the house, we made a video recording of the event, and then, in this case, we extracted the audio from the video. But today, since this Poem Talk episode will be released as a video, we're all together going to watch and listen to Tyrone from that recording. So here now on the big screen behind us is our friend Tyrone Williams performing Charon on the Potomac.
I guess so.
I feel like I'm in class and I should say any questions at this point, but I won't do that. I feel like this is Charon on the Potomac. Potomac? Potomac. I can never. Potomac. I can never. I know you from DC. You can say that, but I can't say that. Charon on the Potomac.
You from D.C. is a reference to Aldon.
Yes.
A cornered stamp is a dangerous coin value driven up, as it is driven to the brink of extinction. Not unlike this conceit by dint of displacement, the lesser abasement compared to a kinship with the coin, I retrieve from the shades of cold lips or wet tongues as my fee for transport to the land of the dead, demeans me to a stamp that man's all hands on deck to ply this river or carry envelopes, shade of shades, from the land of the dead to the land of the living. Reader, a mockery reversal, though this thin difference between the same tenors in different vehicles makes all the difference, proxy per permanence. Or so I'd hope, resigned to middle management by the glass ceiling of a vaulted Alaroth, rumors that it devised nothing from nothing notwithstanding. I envy no plant, animal, or human life as long as my not unimportant role in the play of existence was acknowledged by those forms of life closest to ours, and my name expired dread in those who profess that death is not oblivion. But now as I recall those spheres, domes, and temples, vain aspirants to a glory that once populated the sky, nay heavens, the vanity of this Janus-headed capital offends me, and more, the national, no epochal reduction of me to a children's story cannot and will not go unpunished, however much I lack the power to impose my authority. At least that strange human I once saw on the veranda of a mansion, yet another vain project near the land these Americans call Mount Vernon, seemed to actually see me, for I recognized the terror in his eyes. I smile with pleasure as I sail by with another shipment of red and white savages. Would that his descendants were as humble as they strolled about their vain efforts at capturing time in museums, archives, libraries, memorials. Had I the power, I'd bend that national harbor atrocity, Capitol Hill, into a long train of gondolas plunging down the rapids of an agitated Acheron into my waiting arms, a sneer on my face.
Now, those who are going to be listening to this only on
That was
audio,
I went to DC.
PoemTalk will be not seeing or hearing what happens next, which is we're going to bring the screen back up and pause, and then we'll have our conversation. Right, Zach? He's anticipating the editing ahead. But those watching the video are seeing all this, so yeah.
I didn't know that was so loud.
It's loud. I mean, is there a way
Does the
to?
job.
It does. Definitely does the job. It was a great.
I thought Charon was approaching with his boat.
Okay, here we go. Well, I think we should start with two rounds. Starting with Erica, go down the line here. First, the impression of the reading, of seeing Tyrone, hearing his voice, etc. That could be simply a memorializing feeling. You're invited to just respond. And the second round would be a generalization about Tyrone's language, which is pretty consistent through the years. But it's definitely on show, on display here. The triple meanings and the use of contemporary and ancient the sense of the archive, the punning, capital, et cetera. So I'd love for us to just put that into the record, and then we'll take a closer look. Erica, first round is feeling, seeing and hearing your friend, Tyrone.
Sure. I always think it's a beautiful thing, and it's one of the riches of PennSound is to hear the writer read their own poem. What happens is that the sound gets in, you read it on the page, and you have an impression. But then to hear it in the voice of the poet sort of, injects that language and torques it in a certain way, so you hear them. And you know how to read it even better because of the intonation, the places where they slow down and speed up and so forth. Yeah.
It's hard to believe that for a number of decades, or hundreds of years, the idea that the voice of the poet was important to our apprehending and considering the poem was out of fashion, partly because of technological considerations and partly because the word on the page and printing and all that was such a rage. But it's coming back, so I think it's really important for us to say what you said. Thank you. Aldon, a thought on seeing Tyrone there?
Yeah, several. Well, seeing was the wonderful part, but some people here know I used to do a literary radio show, and around that time I started recording everything. PennSound has many of these recordings. And I discovered something Erica's just alluding to. Once I'd heard a poet read, every time I read that poem, I heard it in their voice, which is not always a good thing. But in Tyrone's case, it certainly is. He, as Al described it, that beautiful baritone voice, which I kind of envy.
You need to smoke more cigarettes, clearly.
But the thing is, Tyrone was not only a humble person, he was a very soft-spoken person. So you needed amplification often to hear him clearly in a room. But that understated voice actually underscored, in the case of this particular poem, some of both the terror and the loveliness of it. Being the scholarly type, the thing that jumps off at me is all the changes that he made between that notebook version and the version that's in the book. Other things he's not responsible for. You may have noticed that the spelling at the very beginning here is Karen, which is absolutely perfect given our political
Charon
moment.
on the Potomac.
Yeah, and a lot of Karens showed up.
Oops.
Yeah. Now,
We're a little embarrassed by that, but it turns out you can't edit the titles without removing the video on YouTube. So
but, yeah.
It was an accidental thing.
Well, just hearing it.
We have a lot of staff who hear Charon.
The poem hadn't been published yet, remember? So they were just putting what they heard. And while I'm normally at least mildly disapproving of stereotypes, Charon is not a cliche addressed to all white women. It's addressed to certain types of white women. So winds up being. But we may talk about more of these changes that he made over time. I'll just mention one very quickly, being the guy from D.C. You'll notice that he referred at one point to the statue on top of the Capitol, and that disappears from the printed version. I don't know how many of you have actually been to the nation's capital. You all saw it on January 6th, but you probably didn't see that statue. It's a statue of freedom. Originally, that statue was supposed to have had an ancient Roman cap called the Cap of Freedom that had been worn by people who had been freed from slavery. Southern congressional representatives and senators, including the soon-to-be president of the Confederacy, objected. And that's why when you look at that statue, you see that warlike helmet that he was thinking of when he talked about this Janus-faced capital.
Thank you. Simone, impression of the video?
Well, I'm first of all just struck by the fact that we were sitting next to each other at dinner maybe just 12 months ago to this day.
We lost him very quickly.
So that is very jarring, but also I'm interested in the fact that so many people who think they don't love poetry are so frequently converted by reading. And I was thinking about the fact that there's so much in this work that could be converted through the personality of Tyrone Williams, but that may be lost.
Yeah. Okay, next round. We're still a little distant. We're not near the close reading yet, but this is an invitation to the three of you just to say something general, especially for people who don't know Tyrone's poetry, how this reflects or is a good instance of the kind of language in the poetry of Tyrone Williams. Erica, you're first.
Yeah, there's a certain density in Tyrone's poems, a density of, there's poems that just have one topic, and maybe it has a couple dimensions. This has a lot of topics. So there's a dense web of concerns, and that's because he works through collage and a kind of, I call it an echo chamber of illusions. That is the echoes of other poems, the echoes of, there's puns, as in Charon, but Charon on the Potomac, right? It's Charon on the River Styx. So the Potomac all of a sudden is being slotted in. That has it's casts its own web of, associations and power and who's powerful and who's not and who's the middleman and all these things. So it's typical, I think, of Tyrone's work, which is he's a complex, layered thinker in poetry, and poetry allows all these quick gymnastic moves that you can't quite do. You can in a prose essay or something.
Well, you can't do it in other genres of nonfiction.
Yeah.
A newspaper article, essay for the Atlantic. If you did that, the editor would say, "What the fuck are you doing?
What are you doing exactly? Complete this. Where is the
capital? We know it's a pun.
Where are the sinews that hold all of this together?"
Our fact
But here
checkers
he
say
can be
that it's
nimble.
not there.
Right. The fact checkers, exactly.
Yeah.
Thank you. Great start, Aldon.
Well, first of all, I just underscore the sheer beauty of the sound of most of Tyrone's poetry, both the rhythm and the assonance and so forth. And you get that here, too. You also get it very strongly in his very last book, which I think we might hear something about later. Although it wasn't his last writings, it was his last published book, Stilettos at Rifle Range. And as Erica was saying, the density of illusion, the way he brings contemporary and historical features together, popular culture and more scholarly things together, is very characteristic of the man. And you see it in a couple of places in this poem. Most of you would recognize Mount Vernon as having been the home of George Washington, who was referred to as a human in this version, but as a hunter in the published version.
Do you think he misread
No.
Hunter? No.
No. But also, at that point, the poem is looking at the Virginia side and the Maryland side. And up that river streamed boats. And in the version you just heard, he refers to red and white, savages. Meaning, on one hand, the Indians that gave their name
I think
to the
red,
place.
white, and black.
Well, but black wasn't in the red version.
Okay.
Yeah.
Got it,
So that got added. Originally, it was just the red and the white, and the white could be a reference to the colonists who destroyed the red cultures there, or it could also be referring to indentured servants and so forth. But he chooses to add the black in the printed version, which brings the human capital that was being ferried up and down that river all together in one phrase. That's the kind of thing he was just wonderful at.
Just a footnote before we turn to Simone on this question. Another plug for PennSound. If you see a book is published in a year that is later than the date given of the reading or the audio, you have got an archaeology of revision. We're already knowing more about revision than possibly anyone would find in the archive if Tyrone has arranged if his papers are available.
They are at they're at Buffalo.
They're at Buffalo, right, okay. So it's possible that we have the revised manuscript, but this is a great way to hear the changes, literally hear the changes being made. So, Simone, generalization about the language?
Yeah, I'm interested in the shape of the transcript that we have, the transcript which is made by, I guess, the poet Anthony Madrid for the YouTube channel. But so what we see is a kind of snaking, very thin, just a couple of words, and as is.
And then you get the next pages.
Yes, and then it's blocky. And so one of the questions that's being raised, of course, is where does the poem begin and where does the prose end, or vice versa? And so these architectures or geometries of sort of phrase making are, I think, characteristic of Tyrone's work, and also of the sort of visual imagination that is always being brought to the work, which is very, very complex again, and often puzzle-like. And this, although it appears to be a narrative, has many elements also of the sort of puzzle, literally, with pieces that need to be fit together of different shapes.
That leads me to a next question, which is getting us a little closer to the poem. Thank you, Simone. we do get a me, a first person me, in the, we'll call it the verse, the verse field like pages. But then we get much more of what we might call a speaker, or our sophomores would call a narrator. Sorry, I didn't mean to say anything mean about sophomores, but poems have speakers.
In the novel, you mean?
Yeah. But anyway, so I'd like to invite, starting with Erica, and we'll see if we all want to do this. The I begins, or so I'd hoped, and then moves into a new direction. This person.
I retrieve from the shades of cold lips.
Yeah. So we have an I. So who, it turns out to be a soliloquy, the first part, I retrieve from the shade. Yeah, exactly. But then in the last 2 pages, which is 4 stanzas or 4 blocks of prose, we get a somewhat more definite I. Who is that? Who's speaking?
I think it's Charon. I think it's Charon the whole way. I think it's Charon as a contemporary who has been brought into the present to surmise, to observe only what Charon can observe.
Can we say for the record who Charon was?
Oh, yeah. So Charon is the ferryman. The ferryman, right? The son of Nyx and Erebus, Nyx being a primordial goddess that, in the sense that she is also the parent of sleeping, dreaming. There's a bunch of things. It's really interesting. She's got a lot of kids, and the point, she's like, she's like up there with Zeus, like primordial, like the first thing.
Is she
the
a
first
Titan
order.
or a god?
She's night. Yeah. And Erebus is night, I think. Yeah. So between the two, he is a person of great power. He's the middleman. In order to die and then go to Hades or to the underworld or the afterlife, you have to pay Charon. And that's where there's a tradition of putting a coin on a tongue. Right?
And what happens if you can't pay?
Oh, then you are condemned to wander the banks of Styx without...
For 100 years.
Yeah, 100 years.
But it was a bargain, though, the amount paid, right?
Yes,
it was
like
a very,
couple of pennies.
Yeah.
It's not a lot of money.
Yeah.
But it's a long and strong tradition that actually, supersedes.
So I interrupted you, but I'm glad I did, because you put into the record the history here. But you were talking about the analogy between Styx and Potomac, Washington, D.C.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah. I think that there's something about not being able to pass over without that. In other words, everybody in Washington, D.C. may have a lot of power, or I know that's not true, but D.C. is sort of the kind of symbol of power, the seat of power. But everybody's got to die. Everybody. And in that dying, you have to pay the price. I mean, I sort of made a reading of this poem about everybody pays a price. You think that you don't have to pay the price. You can be drunk with power. You can be vainglorious, is I think a word that's used in the poem. You can be arrogant. You can be beyond those things which impact the ordinary, the small person. Mm. But not so. Everybody has to pay a price. And the Charon is the person who extracts
the
that
middleman,
price.
Right? Aldon takes a little further on the speaker, the I. Who is that?
I agree that it's Charon all the way through, but it's a more than usually pissed off Charon.
What's he pissed about?
Well, some of this comes in near the end when he complains about being reduced to, what's he say, a children's story. The national, no epical reduction of me to a children's story cannot, it will not go unpunished. And so forth. And again, that's, when you think of the mythology that he's invoking there and the current situation, there's just so much, even in just those few sentences. The joke about not being able to pronounce the word, Potomac is not actually the Indian name of that river. It's what the English people could pronounce when hearing what the Indians said. And of course, the first victims of that were the indigenous peoples themselves. You may not know that the District of Columbia was originally a square. At one point in the 19th century, the Virginia side was given back to Virginia, and that's why it has that kind of odd shape following the river line. The old joke that we all told each other was in the early days of the emerging republic, George Washington and Thomas Jefferson picked out the two nicest pieces of land there and then sold the swamp to the federal government. You'll remember Washington was a surveyor. And there's some truth to that, but this all keeps coming back to that question of capital and human capital. And this is why I think it is so important that he added blacks to the people on the boat with Charon. The two major slave depots in that area during that period were Alexandria, Virginia on that side of the river and Georgetown on the other side of the river. And it took a long time. When my family first moved there, they didn't tell us any of this history. You know, we learned it finally from later history teachers. But, you know, all of that is jumbled up here in the person of Charon, who's eternal and therefore has seen all of this history. It's never clear which side of the river is Hades in this poem, which I find kind of interesting.
Take a guess.
Well, again, the part
Because we have Mount Vernon
the part that he's
Mount
most
Vernon on the other side.
The part that he's most upset about is actually in Maryland. that obscene casino resort with its big Ferris wheel. That's in Maryland side, just below D.C. Yeah, and had the nerve to put national in its name. You know,
Simone, I want to take a turn here, but of course, as the way things go, you can ignore my question and say whatever's on your mind. But I want us all to turn toward the way we read this poem or reread it in a situation in which, you know, Aldon had picked the poem for us with the Washington, D.C. thing in it. Then we have a presidential election, a national election here in the United States. And then we sit at home last night or the night before preparing to come here to talk. So I would love for us, and this breaks a little bit with the close reading, but not too much. I'd love for us all to offer the reading that we make, might call it a post-election reading, of this poem written long before this current situation, but written at a time when the situation is either completely predictable or is in the history of the United States. Did you read it the way I'm implying we did?
I'm sure I couldn't help but read it that way. I am going to ignore the question a little bit just because I wanted to say that one of the things about sort of opening with this I who is Charon is that you're like already in a mess by the time Charon is speaking, right? You don't get to be with Charon unless you're dead, right? And so, or Dante. So, and who's a special exception.
Not dead because he's writing about it.
Right. Really special exception, which puts actually the poet in the sort of same position as Dante.
Yes.
And so it's a strange temporal position to be in. You're between the living and the dead. And so mostly I was thinking about that as a sort of speaking position, but also I mean the eternal fuckedness of the poem.
The eternal
poem's
what?
atmosphere. I don't get to say it again. I said fuckedness. Yeah.
You know, PoemTalk is beyond the reach, at least today, of the FCC.
Okay. So,
we'll check in tomorrow.
but of course, that's what I was thinking. And also, Charon is a peevish character. Beating people with the oars and stuff.
Yeah.
Right, and so
to get them into the boat.
To get them into
You're
the
dead.
boat.
You got to get into this boat.
Right, but also that peevishness is prescient. I think for reading today. Right, you're sort of wondering if you could see everything, if you had known everything, all manner of the dregs of humanity. Right, then what would what would your sort of general attitude towards humans be? And this feels like today, you know.
I had this vibe of Charon as a mail carrier. It's partially the stamp
stamp.
that
Yeah.
keeps,
Well, I
showing
also
up.
thought- I also
It's
thought
like
the
a civil
Stamp Act,
servant, the civil
That's
servant.
precisely right. What do
Right.
you-
About to get fired.
Yeah.
I had to invite Erica and Aldon to say whatever's on their mind, but I'll just add. I read it. I gave it a post-election reading, but I also gave it a post-Tyrone reading because you just said that the only person who's alive in the situation is Charon ferrying people, the dead, and Dante writing about it, but also Tyrone, when he wrote the poem, could get into that boat with the dead and cross it because the poem is about it. And then, of course, he crossed it himself. And so whether that's a legitimate reading of the situation of the subject position, not just the narrator, the speaker, or not, it's what I felt. Erica, you want to go somewhere with this?
Yeah, I think there's a, that's the poetic, it's the poetic and prophetic piece, or the prophetic piece of poetry is that we sometimes write more than we know, we intuit, and, and it happens with a certain amount of frequency. I feel like I wrote about the Twin Towers falling before the Twin Towers fell. I don't know where that came from. And it was an illusion. And this is an illusion,
You also
too.
wrote about Katrina before Katrina happened.
Yeah. There's this odd way that you speak something that you don't even know where it came from, and you write something you don't know where it came from, and it's a little bit prophetic. I think that I got very caught up in this tenor and vehicle section.
Say that.
Because that's another layer. There's the description of Charon and the peevishness about the seat of power, its seeming invulnerability to something like death. But there's also this tenor and vehicle discussion, like line. Let's see if I can read it properly. The difference between the same tenor and different vehicles makes all the difference. Proxy per permanence.
So
Right?
hard.
It's
Yeah.
odd. And then it forced me to, re-examine what the tenor is, what the vehicle is, and, I.A. Richards and all of that. So tenor is the subject. Vehicle is the figurative language, how you say it. Tenor is the subject, the thing you're pointing to, if you will. And I thought, okay, so what is it? Is Charon the tenor? No, there's some other subject. I think Charon is, the speaker, but there is a subject. So then it becomes, what is the subject? I think the subject is power and consequence. And there's this way that we are governed by people with power who don't always think of the consequence. And this election is one of them, right? We've given power. Go back to your electoral, question. We've given power. And there will be consequences, and the consequences are unfathomable. But what is surely the case is there will also be a price for those consequences. As someone says, or as we empower Elon Musk, I guess, to cut $2 trillion from the federal budget. Boy, are there going to be consequences, and there will be also a price. So that's how I kind of, see how this poem intersects in its treatment of the seat of power, the certainty of death.
Charon as poet who lacks the authority to impose her substantial powers, but the reduction of the power of this very important role of ferrying the dead lacks authority, just as you're a poet, there, what can you do about the political situation? And then, of course, the speaker, Charon, and Tyrone Williams turn and see a strange human or a hunter, that would be Washington, standing on the other side of the river on his mansion with all that power, the power of authority. As much as George Washington said, no, I don't want to be a king. Everybody was into the idea of the king. So he was enough of a Democrat to say, I don't want to be a king, but own slaves and so forth. Aldon, take this where you want to.
Well, I'll pick up right there. In fact, Dante, of course, has a guide and a beloved that's not here. Charon, going back to what you said earlier, is eternal and sees everything. So his eyes lock onto Washington's eyes. The Washington who supposedly threw a coin across the river. No doubt never did, but...
chopped down some trees, too.
Yeah. But locks eyes with him because Charon knows not just what has happened, but what will happen. And Washington gets this little glimpse of the American future. I recognized the sudden terror in his eyes and smiled with pleasure. Now, we've all seen that movie where someone is suddenly terrified and the other person is grinning at them, right? But what's happening is that Washington is getting a glimpse of the American future. And this ties in again with the shipment of human beings up and down the river. In some ways, it recalls something Jefferson said, speaking of supposed Democrats. Jefferson, you may know that the original draft of the Declaration of Independence included slavery as one of the things they were accusing the king of having inflicted on the nation. And the other slaveholders required that Jefferson remove that from the draft. So there's no mention of that in the draft. But Jefferson was one of those people who described slavery. He said, it's as if we're riding on a tiger. We've got him by the ears and we can't get off and we can't keep riding. Now, it's a stupid thing to say about such a human invention as the slavery system. But that's probably the way George Washington tended to think about it. Neither one of them freed their slaves. They left provisions in their wills for some to be freed. In Jefferson's case, after Mrs. Jefferson died, she died before him, as it turned out. There was a man, a European colonist, who left provisions that his slaves should be freed, and Jefferson found some way to cancel that. So there's plenty of reason for Charon to see the future that awaited us because he can see the future in the present, if you want to speak in Hegelian terms. So Charon can see all this. And when Washington gets a glimpse of it in Charon's eyes, that's what terrifies him. Okay? But then you get that last stanza, would that his descendants were as humble as Washington, right? As they stroll about dipping cups into their rivers of museums. Again, the river of forgetfulness. You don't think of the museum, the archive, and the library and the memorials as being the river of forgetfulness, but that's kind of what they are as the tourists come and dip into these things.
They've been revised.
Well, even when they have it, okay, you should go to the National Archives and look at the actual Constitution someday. It's a fascinating document. It is true, as one of the defenders of the Amistad rebels said, that there's no mention of the word slavery anywhere in the Constitution. They're very clever about this. There's mention of one date after which transatlantic transportation of people will be forbidden, 1808. And there's the notorious 3/5 compromise and so forth. But the word slavery itself never appears. This is why Frederick Douglass is able to come along later and see the Constitution as possibly being a liberating device in a way that some of the other abolitionists didn't. My students were always amazed to find out how radical the abolitionists were, that they would burn a copy of the Constitution on the steps of Independence Hall here in Philadelphia, things like that. But anyway, so in that, to me, one of the key moments here, because I'm still wondering about the connection between the Stamp Act, coinage, and so forth and so on. But that moment when Charon and Washington lock eyes, and Washington is terrified because at that moment he recognizes what is going to happen in this country. And yet his descendants can't see that, even as they're looking at the documents that produced it, as they're looking at the memorabilia and so forth.
That's the price.
Yeah,
That's the price, yeah.
I want us to turn in a minute to that last stanza, but first, Simone, your thoughts.
I think of it as a personal power struggle, that moment, rather than one over the sort of destiny of the country. And in a way, it's this sense that Charon is humanized to such a degree in the poem. You know, he's a middle manager. You know, he's really pissed off about the postage stamp thing that he's been forced to convert to. And that locking of eyes with Washington in that moment really does seem to me to be a kind of contemporary power struggle of the sort that we understand now, rather than one that is between a sort of divine entity and an earthly one who is almost as powerful, right? And he not because he's afraid of the I mean, this is just my reading, that not because he sees the destiny of the country, which we do want. We know Tyrone wants that to be in there because the black is added, right, to that last line in the stanza. But he passes him by and simply spares his life. That to me was a more sort of plausible reading of that power struggle, because whoever you are, whether you're the king or you're the president or you're George Washington, who's kind of bigger than both, right, of those statuses, those sort of human statuses, then, because he's a legend, he's the founder, he's still subject to Charon's, you know, peevish activity, or you know. And when he lets him go, right, he passes him by and he says, actually, no, this is actually the business that I'm engaged in, the business of trading, right? That I get from that stanza.
I'd like us to look at the last stanza. And I want to ask Erica first what Tyrone Williams is hoping would be his reader's perspective on the situation, what he wants Charon to want to do. Had I the power, I'd. Can you translate what comes after had I the power, I'd? What would Charon/Tyrone do?
It's kind of wild. It's a little homicidal. It is, in fact, homicidal. Yeah. Had I the power, I'd bend that National Harbor atrocity, the capital wheel, into a terrible train of gondolas plunging down the rapids of an agitated Charon, river of woe. Into my waiting arms, a snare on my face, he says here, widening into a maw. It is, whoa.
That's hellish.
Hell yeah.
And like, if you were to draw this or make a little film of it, that last scene, it would be, first of all, scary and R-rated. I think because Charon's ahead of you and also waiting for you at the end of the rapids. Aha. So what translate that into what Tyrone thinks?
It's fury.
Had I the power. Doesn't have the power, he says.
No, it's a lot of fury. I think Washington, the hunter on that hill in Mount Vernon, survives because there's a certain immortality we confer to the founder of a country. Is not subject to the laws of the mortal. So therefore, the fury, though, is spilled out onto subsequent generations. And the curse of that power exercised without regard for consequence.
Thus, the post-election reading of this poem.
Yeah, relive it.
Simone, your thought on what Erica just said, or my question about had I the power, I'd do what, according to Tyrone Williams?
Well, it actually brings me back to the beginning of the poem. Think about the stamps again, and why this sort of action of reduction is so important to the poem. It's hard to work out, I think. Why we can't even deal in specie anymore. We're like working with these, like the forever stamp or something.
I forgot about that.
Yeah, right.
Which does, and there's this question of proxy per permanence, right? That is actually the most interesting words, I think, in the poem for me. Proxy per permanence. What is that? I'm not sure. I guess I'm thinking about the post-election reading and thinking about this, you know, the eternal, the capacity to see all things, to be at the bottom of the river, to be transporting people down at the same time. You're everywhere at once. And I guess, the sort of the fury that's visited upon the Washington tourist, right, on the wheel, who has no capacity to understand the permanent situation. Proxy per permanence, right? It's the way that Charon is made a proxy for that vision, the capacity to see all things, right? That becomes the sort of great action of the poem.
I just want to say a general thing about Tyrone's poetry, or about poetry generally, and then I'm going to invite each of us to offer a final thought on this poem, because you came here today, and I'm sure you had 6 or 7 other things you wanted to say, so I'll invite you to offer one. The thing I want to say about this is that it is true that Aldon and I thought about which single poem to represent Tyrone Williams for this memorial PoemTalk. But it's also true that 90% of the poems we could have chosen would generate not just a conversation that takes 55 minutes, but a similar conversation, because these are his topics. It's the great achievement of a poet that you can dip into the works and pull out a poem that gets you in a conversation that you've been having as a reader. So I'm just saying that. You don't need to reply to that. Just saying that is a remarkable thing about a very great poet. All right, I'm going to invite each of you, starting with Erica, to offer a final thought on this poem, or just anything you came here to say but haven't yet.
One of the things I think is kind of glorious about poetry and talking about poetry is its kind of amplitude. You could talk for a very long time. We could talk more about this poem, including a somewhat abrupt ending that nevertheless communicates, the rage that's been simmering below from the beginning. The other thing I'd say is that I took a look at Blake's Vestibule of Hell.
Yeah, it's Blakean, isn't it?
And there was a concordance in that. What does the vestibule of hell look like?
Excuse me.
Pretty terrifying, and and somehow this poem invoked that for me.
Thank you. Aldon, final thought?
Well, I'm going to go back to what you were saying about that final stanza, because while the poem's about Charon, Al-Araf comes up, which is the heights,
Yes.
but it's also one of the important surahs in the Quran, and it's also a work by Edgar Allan Poe. But going back to that last section, at the end, it's more like a Moses coming down from the mountain and smashing the tablets moment. Because National Harbor, despite its name, is supposed to be a place of amusement, but it's a place of gambling. And so, yes, it's called the Capital Wheel, but notice he spells it with an A. So it's the wheel of capital, not the wheel of the capital. The city is also spelled with A, of course, but these things piling up, starting with the capital, make us keep in mind that this is a place for the generation. It's a place for the fleecing of the public, essentially, who still have to have one coin to be put on their lips or eyes or whatever as they get on the boat to go down with Charon, and Charon is still there. Charon is still there, no matter what else is going on. So it's one of those premonitory moments. That's my version of not being able to pronounce Potomac, I guess. That you read this poem. Will we get the message we're supposed to get? Could the ancient Hebrews get the proper message from the tablets since they were broken? He had to go get them again. We're kind of in that moment where he will always have to give us another poem and another poem and another poem. And we still have to keep struggling to somehow save ourselves from this situation that we've created for ourselves with our history. Anyway.
Thank you. Simone, final thought?
Yeah, I think I was thinking about the fact that many Tyrone Williams poems could not be addressed in 55 minutes because they would require some research or elaboration beyond the poem itself. And so I guess thinking about a poet who is capable of working in this kind of rune system or, that requires us to sort of think not in a grammatical manner but in other kinds of ways, that this poem appears in this way as a sort of, meta mythology and also with contemporary elements. There was something that Tyrone Williams wanted us to be able to access quickly. And I think that's really important, this sort of choice to be able to communicate that fury in a manner that did not require us to hit the dictionary. Or
My final thought has to do with the word forms in the phrase forms of being closest. I'm going to read the sentence across the lines and just say something about forms. I envied no plant, animal, or human as long as my not unimportant role in the play of existence was acknowledged. Okay, acknowledged by what? Acknowledged by whom? Acknowledged by people in power? Acknowledged by slave traders? You got to acknowledge me, okay? Was acknowledged by those forms of being closest to ours, and my name inspired dread by those who profess faith that death is not oblivion. It's a very hard sentence.
The word wasn't being when he read it before, it was life. Then I broadened it to being.
Being where? Where would that
The forms of life being the forms of life closest to ours.
be? And he said being close to our.
No, now it says being.
So it's either
Now it says
forms of being or forms of being closest. It is a very, very difficult sentence to figure out. And to me, it is a hint at the reading I've been trying to push, which is a metapoetic reading, that Tyrone's status or anyone's status as a poet with a politics in a book called As Is would want to suggest that those forms of being closest to ours has something to do with the forms of the poem, the form of the poem, the almost gondola-like or snake-like form of this poem. We're riding the rapids of verse. Watch out.
There is a rapids just above D.C. I'd forgotten that. Great Falls.
Cool. Okay, well, we like to end Poem Talk with a minute or two of Gathering Paradise, which is a chance for us to spread wide our narrow hands. Those are listening are not going to see that I'm Dickinsonian-like, spreading wide my narrow hands to gather a little something poetically good, to hail or commend someone or something going on in the poetry world or the film world or the dance world or the novel world or whatever. Who's got one? Erica, did you have one?
I do. I want to commend to the listeners and people in this room the Chicago Review issue on Julie Patton. It is a work of beauty.
It is.
It includes photos of the museum that she maintains in Cleveland in her house. It includes her writing. She's a hand writer as well as a visual artist. And it includes never in print previously poems. And Julie Patton is, she's a forager. She's a poetry and language forager who deals in phonemes and as almost as if they were flora.
Great suggestion, Julie Patton. Thank you. Aldon.
Well, on the way to mentioning him, I'm going to underscore. I did not know this issue of the Chicago Review existed until just 3 days ago when Giovanni Singleton, God bless her, handed me a copy of it. I was just ecstatic, just thumbing through it. But my Sharing Paradise, what do we call it? Gathering Paradise today will be the most recent book by Don Lundy Martin, which is called Instructions for the Lovers. That title could be slightly misleading, but it is formally innovative, just beautiful set of poetry to read. I can't remember, was it Nightboat? Nightboat Editions. It's well worth your time.
Thank you. Simone White.
I want to acknowledge the passing of Judith Jameson, and also to ask everyone within the 90-mile radius of New York City to head to the Whitney Museum of American Art to check out the Alvin Ailey show curated by Adrian Edwards at the Whitney. It is really something. I have much to say about that.
It's not only Alvin Ailey, but also his contemporaries
Yes.
in visual arts
Yes.
and music and
It's
so
a
forth.
multimedia, incredible
Incredible.
experience of sort of mid-century, late 20th century African American
And
life.
brilliantly
Yeah,
installed.
brilliantly installed.
Brilliant. Like you feel like, oh, this is what it is to be in situ, in context. So you look at Ailey, but you look at all the artwork and music of that time, 60s through
Thank you.
70s.
My Gathering Paradise is something from Tyrone. I'm just knowing about Tyrone's interested in his church community. I'm just going to assume that he believed in paradise or believed in heaven, and I'm just assuming that he's there. And so my Gathering Paradise is to imagine something paradisal, which is Tyrone. And I'm going to read a poem from The Adventures of Pi, which is selected from his early poems, 1980, 1990. The poem is called Where in the World I Am. Not in the world, where in the world am I, but where in the world I am. It has the connotation of I am, that I am. You could call it here on a blue bedspread, on a queen-size bed, in a 10 by 10 bedroom, in a one-bedroom apartment, in a brown apartment building, on a street that crosses a street, in a city that loves the official arts, in a country that loves the official offices, in a state that shot its official students, in a country where life officially begins before birth and after death. That's Tyrone. Yeah, that's quite a poem. Well, that's all the vainglories of the offensive capital we have time for on Poem Talk today. Poem Talk at the Writers' House, collaboration of the Center for Programs in Contemporary Writing, PennSound, the Kelly Writers' House, the University of Pennsylvania. Thanks so much to my guests, Simone White, Aldon Nielsen, and Erica Hunt. And this is, audience, your chance. Put your hands together and show your presence in praise of these people. You guys are so great. Simone, Aldon, and Erica. And Aldon gets the prize for coming the furthest to be with us. Thanks all from California.
Santa Barbara.
Getting here from Santa Barbara was easier than getting from Santa Barbara to Palm Springs. Yes. Go figure that out, L.A. And thanks also to Poem Talk's directors and engineers today, Zach Gardner and Magda Andrews-Hoke back there. And to Poem Talk's editor, the same amazing Zach Gardner, to consult all 207 previous episodes of Poem Talk, dating back to 2007. Please go to poemtalk.org. We post the audio recording of each episode, in this case also the video, but also program notes, photographs of the Poem Talkers, relevant links to PennSound and elsewhere. Poem Talk is also available at Spotify and Apple Podcasts, so check us out, subscribe, and leave a review. And if you leave us a review, you will be the first person ever to leave us a review. I don't know that that's true, but This is Al Filreis, and I hope you'll join us again next month for another episode of Poem Talk.